I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the bright orange violation notice flapping against my front door like some kind of death warrant. The morning had started peacefully enough in my modest ranch-style home in Parkwood Estates, a planned community just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I'd moved here 6 months ago, thinking the well-maintained lawns and cheerful neighbors would be a welcome change from my cramped apartment downtown. The HOA fees seemed reasonable at $200 a month, and the covenant documents I'd skimmed during closing hadn't raised any red flags. That was my first mistake. I pulled the notice from where it had been taped, the adhesive leaving a sticky residue on my freshly painted door. The paper trembled slightly in my hand as I read the typed violations. Unapproved exterior paint color on front door. Mailbox not regulation height. Trash cans visible from street on non-collection day. Total fines, $450. My jaw dropped. I'd painted my door a deep navy blue just 3 weeks ago, specifically choosing a color from the approved palette listed in the community guidelines. The mailbox had been installed by the previous owner and hadn't been touched. And my trash cans. I'd rolled them back from the curb exactly 2 hours after collection yesterday morning, just like I did every Wednesday. The signature at the bottom made my blood run cold. Brenda Patterson, HOA board president. I'd met Brenda exactly twice since moving in. The first time, she'd shown up uninvited during my housewarming party to inform me that gatherings required a permit if more than 10 cars were parked on the street. The second time, she'd knocked on my door at 7 in the morning to complain that my lawn was a 1/4 inch too tall. She was everything you'd expect from an HOA tyrant. Late 40s, blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut, and a perpetual expression that suggested she'd just discovered someone had failed to separate their recycling properly. What made this violation notice particularly infuriating was what I could see directly across the street. My neighbor, Greg Hallbrook, had a bright red front door that definitely wasn't on any approved color list I'd seen. His mailbox leaned at a 20-degree angle and was at least 3 inches shorter than mine. And his garbage cans. They'd been sitting beside his garage, fully visible from the street, for the past 4 days. I marched across the cul-de-sac, violation notice clutched in my fist. Greg was watering his lawn, the spray creating rainbows in the early morning sun. He was in his mid-30s like me, worked in finance, and had always been friendly enough in our brief encounters. "Hey, Greg," I called out, trying to keep my voice level. "Quick question. Have you ever gotten any violation notices from the HOA?" He turned off the water and walked over, curiosity evident on his face. "Violation notices? No, never. Why?" I showed him the paper. His eyes widened as he read through the list. "Wait, they're fining you for your door color. But yours is actually nice, and it looks like it's from the approved list." "That's what I thought," I said, frustration bleeding into my words. "But here's the thing. Your door is bright red. Your mailbox is shorter than mine and crooked. Your trash cans have been out since Saturday. Why am I getting fined and you're not?" Greg glanced back at his house, then at mine. A troubled expression crossed his face. "That's weird, man. Really weird. I've lived here for 5 years and Brenda's never said a word to me about any of that stuff. You're friends with her or something?" "God, no," he laughed. "I barely talk to her. She's kind of intense." I thanked him and headed back home, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Brenda had mixed up addresses or had been having a bad day when she'd done her inspection rounds. I decided to handle this the adult way. I'd call her, explain the situation, and get this sorted out. The number for the HOA office was on the violation notice. I dialed it, practicing patient, reasonable tones in my head while it rang. Parkwood Estates HOA, Brenda Patterson speaking. Her voice was clipped and professional. Hi, Brenda. This is Owen Irving from 1247 Maple Grove Circle. I received a violation notice this morning, and I think there might be some confusion. There's no confusion, Mr. Irving. The violations are clearly documented with photographic evidence and time stamps. Her immediate defensiveness caught me off guard. Okay, well, the first one mentions my door color being unapproved, but I specifically chose navy blue because it was listed in the community guidelines as an acceptable color. The approved color is colonial navy. Your door is painted Baltic Sea blue. They're different shades. I blinked. You're fining me because my navy is slightly different from the approved navy. Rules are rules, Mr. Irving. If we make exceptions, the whole community falls apart. Fine, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. What about the mailbox? I haven't touched it since I moved in. It's 7 inches too tall according to our standards. Previous violations were grandfathered in only for the original owner. When property changes hands, all fixtures must be brought up to current code. This was insane. And the trash cans. I brought them in 2 hours after collection. The ordinance states trash receptacles must be removed from view within 1 hour of collection completion. You were photographed at the 68-minute mark, still having them visible. You were timing me. My voice rose despite my best efforts. I document all violations thoroughly, Mr. Irving. This ensures fairness across the community. Speaking of fairness, I said, my neighbor across the street has violations that are much more obvious than anything I've supposedly done. His door is bright red, his mailbox is crooked and short, and his trash cans have been out for days. Why isn't he getting fined? There was a long pause. When Brenda spoke again, her voice had gone arctic. Mr. Irving, I don't appreciate you trying to deflect from your own violations by pointing fingers at your neighbors. That's extremely childish. Your fines stand. You have 30 days to correct the violations and pay the penalties, or they will increase by 50% and will file a lien against your property. Have a good day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone in disbelief. In my previous life, I'd worked as a paralegal for 3 years before transitioning into technical writing. I knew enough about law to recognize when something wasn't right, and this situation reeked of selective enforcement. The question was, why was I being targeted? Over the next week, I became obsessed with documenting everything. I took photographs of every house in the neighborhood, noting violations large and small. Mrs. Chen, 3 houses down, had potted plants on her porch that weren't terracotta, which violated Section 4.7 of the covenant. The Rodriguezes had a lawn gnome visible from the street, clearly against the no decorative yard statuary rule. The Mitchells had painted their shutters a sage green that definitely wasn't on the approved list. None of them had violation notices on their doors. I photographed Greg's house from multiple angles, documenting his red door, crooked mailbox, and trash cans that remained beside his garage in full view. I checked the collection schedule. Pickup was every Wednesday. It was now the following Tuesday, and those cans hadn't moved. I also started attending HOA board meetings. They were held the second Tuesday of each month in the community clubhouse, a bland building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a small gym and pool. I'd never gone before, figuring they were boring administrative affairs that didn't concern me. The meeting room was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. Brenda presided from the center, flanked by 4 other members. Tom McKenzie, a retired accountant, Lisa Harmon, a real estate agent, David Chen, an engineer, and Patricia Wells, a stay-at-home mom. About 15 other residents were scattered through the audience. I took a seat in the back and listened as they discussed budget items, upcoming landscaping projects, and pool maintenance schedules. It was exactly as boring as I'd expected, until they reached the enforcement report. "I've issued 17 violation notices this month," Brenda announced, consulting a spreadsheet. "Mostly for lawn height violations and unapproved exterior modifications. I'm pleased to report compliance has been excellent, with only one homeowner disputing their fines." She didn't look at me, but I knew she meant me. "How do you determine which properties to inspect?" I asked, raising my hand. All heads turned toward me. Brenda's expression could have frozen lava. "I conduct regular neighborhood walkthroughs," she said. "Any property in violation gets documented and receives a notice. You inspect every property equally, of course. We have standards that apply to everyone." "That's interesting," I said, pulling out my phone. "Because I've documented significant violations at multiple properties that haven't received any notices. Would you like to see them?" The room had gone very quiet. Tom Mackenzie leaned forward, interest sparking in his eyes. "What kind of violations?" I stood up and walked toward the front, pulling up my photo gallery. Unapproved door colors, non-compliant mailboxes, trash cans left out well beyond the 1-hour window, unauthorized yard decorations, incorrect paint colors on shutters and trim. All clearly visible, all documented with time stamps. None of them have received violation notices according to the homeowners I've spoken with. Brenda's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Mr. Irving, I don't appreciate these accusations. My enforcement record is thorough and fair." "Then why haven't these violations been addressed?" I showed the photos to the other board members. Lisa Harmon frowned as she looked through them. "Brenda, that is Mr. Holbrook's house, isn't it? His door really is quite red." "It's a heritage color," Brenda said quickly. "Grandfathered in from before the current color restrictions." "I bought my house 6 months ago," I said. "Greg Holbrook bought his 5 years ago. If my previous owner's mailbox height isn't grandfathered, why is his door color?" David Chen adjusted his glasses, studying the photos on my phone with an engineer's attention to detail. "These are good questions, Brenda. Maybe we should review the enforcement protocols to ensure consistency." "There's no need," Brenda snapped. "I know the rules better than anyone. I've been board president for 6 years. Actually," Patricia Wells spoke up softly, "I've been wondering about this too. My sister lives 2 streets over and she mentioned she's never gotten any notices, even though her landscaping definitely isn't up to code. But she's friends with you, Brenda, and I thought maybe that was why." The meeting dissolved into uncomfortable murmuring. Tom Mackenzie called for order, suggesting they table the enforcement discussion until the next meeting and conduct a comprehensive review of recent violations and enforcement patterns. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but she was outvoted 4-1. I left the meeting feeling vindicated but also worried. I just publicly challenged the most powerful person in the HOA, someone who clearly had it out for me already. This wasn't going to end well. I was right to worry. 2 days later, I received another violation notice. This one cited me for parking my car on the street overnight, having a basketball hoop attached to my garage, and maintaining a garden bed that extended 6 inches beyond the approved boundary. The fines totaled $600. The parking violation was ridiculous because I'd parked in my driveway. The basketball hoop belonged to the previous owner and had been there when I moved in. The garden bed had also been installed by the previous owner and hadn't been touched. I took photos of everything, time-stamped and geotagged. Then I walked the neighborhood again. 12 cars were parked on the street overnight, including Greg's SUV right across from my house. 6 other houses had basketball hoops. Garden beds of various sizes adorned at least 20 properties, many extending well beyond wherever this approved boundary supposedly was. This was targeted harassment, plain and simple. I called a lawyer the next morning. His name was Marcus Pemberton, and he specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Charlotte, a sleek high-rise with a view of the city skyline. Marcus was in his early 50s, with graying hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. He listened to my story, reviewed my documentation, and leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "This is textbook selective enforcement," he said. "The question is whether it rises to the level of discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, or if it's a violation of your constitutional right to equal protection." "Can HOAs violate constitutional rights?" I asked. "They're private organizations. That's a complicated question." Generally, private entities aren't bound by the Constitution the same way government entities are. However, HOAs operate under state law and have significant power over property rights. There's legal precedent for applying equal protection principles to HOA enforcement, especially in cases where selective enforcement appears to be discriminatory. "You think that's what's happening here?" Marcus tapped his pen against his notepad. "Let's look at the facts. You're being cited for violations that are identical to or less severe than violations at other properties. Those other properties aren't receiving citations. The only differences I can see from what you've described are property location and homeowner identity. Is there any pattern you've noticed about who gets cited versus who doesn't?" I thought about it. "The properties that aren't getting cited, most of them have been in the neighborhood longer. They're owned by people who seem to be friends with Brenda or at least friendly acquaintances. The ones getting cited," I trailed off as realization hit me. "They're newer residents or people who have had conflicts with the board. That's not protected class discrimination under the Fair Housing Act," Marcus said, "but it could be a breach of the HOA's duty to enforce rules uniformly. More importantly, if we can prove a systematic pattern of selective enforcement, we might have grounds for an equal protection challenge, especially if you've suffered quantifiable damages. The fines are over $1,000 now. That's a start. But there's also the diminution of your property value if these violations go on record. The stress and time spent dealing with this, and potential future impacts. Here's what I recommend. We send a formal demand letter to the HOA board, outlining the selective enforcement pattern and demanding that all fines be rescinded and enforcement be conducted uniformly. We'll give them a chance to make this right before we file suit. And if they don't, then we file a lawsuit alleging breach of fiduciary duty, selective enforcement, and violation of the HOA's governing documents. We'll seek damages, injunctive relief requiring uniform enforcement, and possibly removal of Brenda Patterson from the board. We'll also request discovery of all enforcement records for the past 3 years, which should expose the full pattern of her behavior. I authorized him to send the letter. It went out via certified mail the next day, meticulously detailing every instance of selective enforcement, including photographic evidence and witness statements from neighbors I'd interviewed. The letter demanded rescission of all fines, a formal apology, and implementation of a fair enforcement protocol within 14 days. The response came in 10 days, and it wasn't what we'd hoped for. The HOA's lawyer, a firm called Hendricks and Associates, sent a terse letter denying all allegations. They claimed that Brenda's enforcement was thorough and unbiased, that any differences in citation rates were due to timing and the severity of violations, and that my complaints were frivolous attempts to avoid legitimate penalties. They also informed me that my fines had now increased to $1,500 due to non-payment, and a lien would be filed against my property if I didn't pay within 7 days. Marcus read the letter and shook his head. They're playing hardball, that's fine. We'll file suit. The lawsuit was filed in Mecklenburg County Superior Court 3 days later. Owen Irving v. Parkwood Estates Homeowners Association and Brenda Patterson, individually. We alleged selective enforcement, breach of fiduciary duty, breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and sought both compensatory and punitive damages. The local news picked up the story within a week. A reporter named Jennifer Moss from the Charlotte Observer called me for an interview. She'd been working on a series about HOA abuses and was fascinated by the equal protection angle. HOA horror stories are becoming increasingly common, she told me over coffee at a cafe near my house. But most people don't fight back because the cost of litigation is prohibitive. The fact that you're pursuing this, and that you have such solid documentation, could be really important. Her article ran on the front page of the local section. Charlotte man sues HOA over selective enforcement, alleges systematic bias against new residents. It included photos of my house versus Greg's house, side-by-side comparisons that made the disparity obvious. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly. Other Parkwood Estates residents called to share their own stories of selective enforcement. People from other HOAs across Charlotte reached out to tell me about similar experiences. A woman named Dorothy Thompson, who lived 4 houses down from me, came to my door in tears. "I got a violation notice today," she said, showing me the paper with shaking hands, "for my porch furniture. It's been there for 3 years and now suddenly it's a problem. This happened 2 days after I told my neighbor I thought what was happening to you was wrong." I documented her case and added it to our evidence file. More retaliation followed. The HOA suddenly announced a special assessment of $500 per household for emergency drainage repairs. Every house was assessed, except for a select few that happened to be owned by Brenda's close associates. My mailbox was vandalized. The post sawed halfway through so it collapsed. Someone left a note on my car. "New residents should learn their place." I reported everything to the police and my lawyer. Marcus was building an intimidation and retaliation claim to add to our lawsuit. The discovery process began in earnest. We subpoenaed all HOA enforcement records for the past 5 years, including Brenda's inspection logs, photographs, correspondence, and board minutes. What we found was damning. Brenda had kept meticulous records, which proved to be her undoing. Her inspection logs showed that she walked the entire neighborhood weekly, but her citation patterns revealed clear bias. Long-term residents received citations at a rate of less than 5% for observed violations. Residents who'd moved in within the past 2 years received citations at a rate of 73%. Residents who'd filed complaints against the HOA or attended board meetings to raise concerns received citations at a rate of 92%. The photographic evidence was even more striking. Brenda had documented hundreds of violations across the neighborhood, but had only issued notices for a fraction of them. When we cross-referenced the properties she'd photographed but not cited against HOA records, a pattern emerged. They were all owned by people who served on committees, attended HOA social events, or had personal relationships with board members. My case wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. Marcus scheduled a deposition with Brenda. I attended, sitting in a conference room at his office while Brenda sat across from us, her lawyer beside her. She looked older than I remembered, stress evident in the lines around her eyes. Marcus was polite but relentless. He walked her through her inspection logs, asking her to explain each discrepancy. Why had she photographed Mr. Ramirez's unapproved fence color but not issued a citation? Why had she documented Mrs. Stewart's oversized shed but taken no action? Why had she noted violations at 23 properties owned by long-term residents but issued 0 citations? I used my discretion, Brenda said repeatedly. Some violations were minor. Some homeowners corrected them before I could send notices. But you didn't extend that same discretion to Mr. Irving, did you? His trash cans were 8 minutes past the 1-hour deadline. That's a minor violation by any measure, yet you cited him immediately. He's a new resident. He needed to understand the community standards. By your logic, shouldn't new residents receive more discretion while they learn the rules, not less? Brenda's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Marcus had gotten her to admit on record that she treated new residents differently. The deposition continued for 6 hours. By the end, Brenda looked exhausted and defeated. Marcus had extracted admission after admission, building an irrefutable case of selective enforcement. But the most explosive revelation came from a different source entirely. One of the other board members, David Chen, reached out to my lawyer independently. He wanted to meet in person, off the record. We arranged to meet at a park in a different part of Charlotte, away from Parkwood Estates. David was nervous, constantly looking around as if afraid of being seen. I should have said something years ago, he told us, but Brenda has a way of making you feel like you're the problem if you question her. What do you want to tell us? Marcus asked gently. Brenda has been running a scheme, David said. She deliberately targets new residents and people she doesn't like with citations. Most people just pay the fines because it's easier than fighting. The money goes into the HOA general fund, but Brenda controls the budget. She's been using those fine revenues to fund projects that benefit her friends' properties or to give contracts to companies owned by her family members. Marcus leaned forward. Can you prove this? I have copies of the financial records. I'm on the board, so I have access. I started keeping records last year when I noticed discrepancies. He pulled out a flash drive. It's all here. Payments to her brother's landscaping company, well above market rate. Repairs to the pool house that primarily benefits the residents on her street. She's been essentially embezzling HOA funds by creating a fine revenue stream through selective enforcement, and then directing that money to herself and her associates. This changed everything. What had started as a simple case of HOA overreach was now potential fraud and embezzlement. Marcus contacted the North Carolina Secretary of State's office and the local district attorney. Financial crimes against HOAs fell under state jurisdiction, and if David's evidence showed what he claimed, Brenda could be facing criminal charges. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement got involved. The DA's office subpoenaed complete financial records from Parkwood Estates HOA. Forensic accountants began tracing payments and comparing them to legitimate expenses. What they found exceeded even David's allegations. Over the past 6 years, Brenda had collected over $200,000 in fines from selective enforcement. Of that amount, approximately $120,000 had been diverted to contracts with companies owned by her family members, or paid for improvements that primarily benefited a small group of properties. She'd also written herself bonus checks totaling $30,000 for administrative duties, despite being a volunteer board president. The news coverage exploded. What had been a local interest story became regional and then national news. HOA abuse was a hot topic, and my case provided a perfect example of how unchecked power could lead to corruption. Jennifer Moss from The Observer won an award for her investigative reporting on the story. The criminal charges came down 3 months after we'd filed the initial lawsuit. Brenda Patterson was indicted on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The HOA's lawyer dropped their defense of the civil suit immediately, and the board voted to settle with me for $25,000 in damages, rescission of all fines, and a formal apology. But I wasn't satisfied with just settling my own case. With Marcus's help, we organized a class action lawsuit on behalf of all Parkwood Estates residents who'd been subjected to selective enforcement over the past 6 years. 43 homeowners joined the suit. The settlement, funded by the HOA's liability insurance, totaled $300,000 distributed among the plaintiffs. More importantly, we demanded structural reforms. The HOA was required to implement a new enforcement protocol with the following provisions. All violations must be documented and tracked in a centralized database accessible to all residents. Citations must be issued uniformly based on objective criteria. Any homeowner could request review of enforcement decisions by the full board, and the board president's enforcement authority was subject to oversight by an independent compliance committee. Brenda's criminal trial took place 8 months after the charges were filed. I attended every day, sitting in the courtroom gallery and watching as prosecutors methodically dismantled her defenses. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd been acting in what she believed was the HOA's best interest, that any financial irregularities were honest mistakes, that she'd devoted countless hours to the community. The jury didn't buy it. They convicted her on all counts after just 3 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison, though she'd be eligible for parole after serving 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $120,000 to the HOA and perform 500 hours of community service after her release. I watched as they led her out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me just felt tired. The aftermath took years to fully resolve. The HOA elected a new board with David Chen serving as president. They hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day enforcement, removing the potential for personal bias. Property values in Parkwood Estates actually increased once word spread that the toxic enforcement environment had been cleaned up. Greg Holbrook, my neighbor whose violations had first opened my eyes to the selective enforcement pattern, became one of my closest friends. We'd grill out on summer evenings, watching our kids play in the yards that had once been sources of such stress and conflict. Other residents who'd been targeted by Brenda's scheme slowly repaired their relationships with the community. Dorothy Thompson, who'd been retaliated against for supporting me, joined the new compliance committee and became a fierce advocate for fair treatment of all residents. Jennifer Moss's reporting on my case sparked a broader conversation about HOA reform in North Carolina. State legislators introduced bills requiring HOAs to maintain transparent enforcement records, implement anti-retaliation protections, and submit to regular audits. Some of those reforms passed, others stalled in committee. But the conversation itself was important. Marcus Pemberton became something of an expert in HOA litigation. He started taking on more cases like mine, building a practice around protecting homeowners from abusive associations. We stayed in touch, and he'd occasionally call to ask if I'd speak to new clients about my experience. Looking back on those months of stress, documentation, legal battles, and eventual vindication, I realized the experience changed me fundamentally. I'd always been someone who followed rules, who avoided conflict, who assumed authority figures acted in good faith. Brenda Patterson's selective enforcement shattered those assumptions. I learned that rules only matter if they're applied fairly. That power without accountability inevitably leads to corruption. That documentation and persistence can overcome institutional bias. That speaking up, even when it's scary and expensive and exhausting, is sometimes the only way to create change. The navy blue door on my house never got repainted. It became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that I'd stood up for myself and my community. Visitors sometimes ask about it, having heard the story through news coverage or word of mouth. I tell them it's just a door, but it represents something bigger. The principle that everyone deserves equal treatment under the rules that govern their lives. My mailbox, precisely regulation height now after I'd replaced it to comply with actual written standards rather than Brenda's arbitrary measurements, still stands straight and true. My trash cans get rolled back within the 1-hour window, not because I fear retaliation, but because it's genuinely considerate to neighbors. My garden beds remain exactly where the previous owner placed them, 6 inches beyond whatever arbitrary boundary Brenda had invented. The special assessment for drainage repairs was rescinded after an independent inspection revealed no drainage issues existed. The $500 was returned to all residents who'd paid it. The vandalism to my mailbox was never solved, though I had my suspicions about who'd been responsible. One unexpected outcome of the entire ordeal was the sense of community that developed among residents who'd been targeted. We formed a support group that met monthly, initially to share experiences and evidence for the class action suit, but eventually evolving into genuine friendships. We celebrated holidays together, helped each other with home projects, and created the kind of neighborhood connections that HOAs theoretically exist to foster, but often undermine. The insurance company that covered Parkwood Estates, HOA's liability policy, dropped them after the settlement, citing the systematic nature of the abuses. The new board had to scramble to find coverage, eventually securing a policy with significantly higher premiums. Those costs were distributed across all residents, which some people grumbled about, but David Chen addressed it head-on at a board meeting. "These higher costs are the price we pay for years of mismanagement and abuse," he said. "We can either accept responsibility for allowing one person to wield unchecked power, or we can pretend the problem was isolated to Brenda alone. I suggest we choose honesty. We all saw signs of her selective enforcement. Most of us did nothing. That enabled her corruption. These higher premiums are a reminder to stay vigilant." It was a sobering message, but necessary. I also learned things about myself I hadn't known. Before this experience, I would have described myself as someone who avoided confrontation. I'd been the kid in school who mediated disputes between friends, the employee who smoothed over conflicts between coworkers. The idea of filing a lawsuit, of publicly challenging authority, of standing up in board meetings to call out corruption, all of that would have terrified the person I'd been before moving to Parkwood Estates. But when faced with genuine injustice, something shifted in me. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of being fined for having trash cans visible for 8 extra minutes while my neighbors sat out for days without consequence. Maybe it was the principle of the thing, The recognition that if I didn't fight back, Brenda would continue targeting others. Maybe it was simply that I'd reached my limit for tolerating institutional bullying. Whatever the reason, I found reserves of courage and determination I hadn't known existed. I learned to document everything with obsessive precision. I learned to speak up in public forums despite my racing heart. I learned to work with lawyers, reporters, and other professionals to build a case. I learned that individual action, backed by solid evidence and principle, really could create change. The experience also taught me about the legal system's complexities. Marcus explained that we'd been fortunate in several ways. First, Brenda's meticulous documentation of violations she chose not to enforce provided irrefutable proof of selective enforcement. Many similar cases fail because the evidence is more ambiguous. Second, David Chen's decision to come forward with financial records transformed the case from a civil dispute to a criminal matter, bringing resources and authority that individual plaintiffs rarely access. Third, the clear pattern of bias affecting dozens of residents made a class action viable, spreading legal costs and creating strength in numbers. Without those factors, my individual lawsuit might have dragged on for years, costing far more than the $1,500 in fines I'd been fighting. I met other homeowners in different communities who'd faced similar selective enforcement but couldn't afford to fight it. They paid unjust fines, lived under constant threat of violation notices, and eventually sold their homes at a loss just to escape the hostile environment. The system, too, often favored those with power and resources. That realization sparked another change in me. I started volunteering with a nonprofit called Fair Housing Advocates that helped homeowners navigate disputes with HOAs. I couldn't provide legal advice, but I could share my experience, help people document violations, and connect them with resources. Some cases settled quickly once HOAs realized the homeowner was serious about fighting back. Others required lengthy battles. A few couldn't be won, limited by finances or insufficient evidence. Each case reinforced my understanding that the laws governing HOAs needed reform. These organizations wielded enormous power over people's homes and lives, yet operated with minimal oversight. Board members were often volunteers with no training in governance or law. Financial controls were frequently inadequate. Enforcement mechanisms relied on individual judgment, creating opportunities for bias and abuse. I testified before a state legislative committee studying HOA reform. I described my experience, showed the side-by-side photos of my house and Greg's house, explained how selective enforcement had been used to generate revenue that was then embezzled. Legislators asked thoughtful questions about what reforms would have prevented or exposed the abuse earlier. Some of my recommendations made it into proposed legislation. Mandatory financial audits for HOAs above a certain size, required training for board members on fiduciary duties and fair enforcement, transparent violation tracking systems, anti-retaliation protections for homeowners who file complaints or attend board meetings. The bills faced opposition from property management companies and some HOA advocacy groups who argued that excessive regulation would be burdensome and expensive. The debate continued as I wrote this account. Democracy moves slowly, especially when challenging entrenched interests. But the conversation itself represented progress. Meanwhile, life in Parkwood Estates gradually normalized. The professional management company brought consistency to enforcement that had been lacking under Brenda's regime. Violations were still cited, but they were applied uniformly based on objective standards. The process included a warning period for minor infractions and a clear appeal mechanism. Fines were reserved for repeated violations or significant issues that impacted property values or safety. Interestingly, compliance actually improved under the new system. When people trusted that rules were being applied fairly, they were more willing to follow them. The adversarial relationship between residents and the HOA board softened. Meetings became collaborative rather than confrontational. People volunteered for committees knowing their time would be used productively rather than to enforce someone's personal agenda. The community spaces improved as well. The pool got a long overdue renovation, funded by reserves that Brenda had claimed didn't exist, but were discovered during the financial audit. The playground equipment was updated with modern safety features. Landscaping along the entrance became a genuine source of pride rather than another potential violation issue. I even started to appreciate some aspects of living in an HOA. When my neighbor 2 doors down started a major renovation that would have been noisy and disruptive, the HOA's construction guidelines required them to provide advance notice and limit work hours. The rules protected everyone's quality of life. When someone tried to convert their garage into a commercial auto repair shop, the HOA's covenants prevented it, maintaining the residential character of the neighborhood. Rules, applied fairly and reasonably, served legitimate purposes. The key was fairness. Equal protection under the rules we'd all agreed to when buying our homes. It was a simple principle, but one that had been systematically violated for years until enough people demanded accountability. Greg and I often talked about the strange circumstances that had brought the whole scandal to light. If Brenda had been slightly more subtle in her selective enforcement, if she'd issued me warnings before fines, if she'd occasionally cited a few of her friends' properties to maintain a veneer of fairness, the scheme might have continued indefinitely. Her arrogance had been her downfall. "You did everyone a favor by being stubborn," Greg told me one evening as we sat on my patio, watching fireflies dance across the lawns. "Most people would have just paid the fines and moved on." "I couldn't," I said. "It wasn't even about the money by that point. It was the principle." She looked me in the eye and said enforcement was fair while your red door was literally visible in the background. The gaslighting was infuriating. "Well, your stubbornness exposed a criminal enterprise. That's pretty impressive for a dispute that started over trash cans." We both laughed at the absurdity of it. Trash cans. That's what had sparked this entire chain of events. 8 minutes past the 1-hour deadline, documented with photographic evidence and timestamps, had revealed years of corruption and embezzlement. Sometimes I wondered what my life would have been like if I just paid those initial fines. I'd be out $1,400, but I wouldn't have spent months consumed by legal battles and documentation. I wouldn't have become a minor public figure in HOA reform circles. I wouldn't have the friends I'd made through the experience, or the satisfaction of knowing I'd created change that benefited dozens of families. On balance, I was glad I'd fought. The cost had been high in terms of stress and time, but the principle had been worth defending. And the outcome had exceeded what I'd hoped for when filing that first lawsuit. I'd wanted my fines rescinded and fair enforcement going forward. What I'd gotten was justice, systemic reform, and a community transformed. Brenda served her sentence at a minimum security facility about 90 miles from Charlotte. I never visited her, though Jennifer Moss interviewed her once for a follow-up article. According to the piece, Brenda claimed she'd been trying to maintain high standards for the community, and that her financial decisions had been misunderstood. She showed no real remorse, viewing herself as a victim of vindictive residents who'd failed to appreciate her dedication. Reading that article, I felt a mixture of anger and pity. She'd had real power to shape a community positively. She could have been a force for maintaining property values and quality of life while treating everyone fairly. Instead, she'd chosen to wield her authority as a weapon against people she viewed as lesser or threatening. She'd confused control with leadership and uniformity with standards. The judge who sentenced her had said something that stuck with me. HOA board members hold positions of trust. Residents rely on them to act in the community's best interest, not their own. When that trust is betrayed through selective enforcement and financial self-dealing, it undermines the very foundation of community governance. You had opportunities to lead with integrity. You chose corruption. The consequences must reflect the severity of that choice. Those words applied beyond just Brenda's criminal behavior. They spoke to the broader principle at the heart of my equal protection challenge. Any system of rules requires trust that they'll be applied fairly. When enforcement becomes selective, when some people are held to strict standards while others face no accountability, the entire system loses legitimacy. That was true for HOAs, but it was also true for governments, corporations, schools, and any other institution that wielded power over people's lives. My experience with Parkwood Estates HOA had taught me to question authority, demand transparency, and refuse to accept, because I said so, as a justification for disparate treatment. Years later, I still lived in that same house on Maple Grove Circle. The navy blue door remained, slightly faded now but still beautiful in the afternoon light. My garden flourished in those beds that extended 6 inches beyond Brenda's imaginary boundary. My regulation height mailbox stood straight and strong, a small monument to the principle that rules should be clear, written, and applied equally. New residents moved in periodically, and I always made a point to welcome them. I'd share a condensed version of the HOA's history, not to scare them but to empower them. If you ever feel like you're being treated unfairly, document everything and speak up, I'd tell them. The board is required to enforce rules uniformly now. Don't be afraid to hold them accountable. Some listened with wide eyes, stunned that such drama had unfolded in this peaceful-looking suburb. Others nodded knowingly, having their own HOA horror stories from previous homes. All of them seemed grateful for the warning and the encouragement. The community I'd fought so hard to reform had become genuinely special to me. Not because it was perfect, but because it represented the power of ordinary people demanding fairness and accountability from those in authority. Every time I drove past the neighborhood entrance, every time I attended a board meeting and saw transparent enforcement reports, every time I heard a new resident praise the welcoming environment, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. My experience had started with selective enforcement of petty rules. It had exposed a pattern of corruption that had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my community. It had resulted in criminal convictions, civil settlements, and systemic reforms. But most importantly, it had proven that equal protection wasn't just an abstract legal principle. It was a fundamental requirement for any just system of governance, no matter how small or local. And it all started because someone decided to enforce trash can rules on me but not my neighbor. The pettiness of that initial violation, contrasted with the significance of what it revealed, never ceased to amaze me. Justice, it turned out, sometimes began with the smallest injustices, the ones that seemed too trivial to challenge but that expose patterns too important to ignore. I kept all the documentation in a filing cabinet in my home office. Photos of violations, board meeting minutes, legal filings, newspaper articles, the settlement agreement, even the original orange violation notice that had started everything. Sometimes I'd flip through them, remembering the anger and determination I'd felt, the long nights preparing evidence, the anxiety before depositions and court hearings. But mostly I looked forward rather than back. The reforms we'd implemented were working. The new board was functioning well. The community was thriving. And somewhere, maybe in another suburb in another state, someone else was getting an unjust violation notice and deciding whether to pay it or fight it. I hoped they'd fight. I hoped they'd document everything, find good legal counsel, and expose whatever pattern of selective enforcement or corruption existed in their community. I hoped my story, told in news articles and legislative testimony and conversations with other homeowners, would give them courage. Because equal protection wasn't a gift granted by authorities. It was a right that had to be demanded, defended, and enforced by those it was meant to serve. My neighbor's red door and my navy blue door had stood as silent witnesses to that truth. And as long as those doors remained, they'd remind everyone who saw them that fairness wasn't optional. It was essential. The sun set over Parkwood Estates, casting long shadows across the well-maintained lawns and regulation mailboxes. Children played in yards, neighbors chatted across property lines, and the community hummed with the peaceful rhythm of suburban life. It looked exactly like it had when I'd first moved in, but everything had changed. Justice had been served. Reforms had been implemented. A corrupt board president sat in prison, and I sat on my patio, looking at my navy blue door, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance against unfairness could reshape an entire community. That knowledge, more than any settlement check or court victory, was the real victory. The principle had won. Equal protection had prevailed, and that made all the struggle worthwhile.